Happy Friday, everybody. The Friday before the pre-release, I like to do my pre-release guide. And so we'll be focusing mostly on what you're going to open in play boosters, less so what's going to happen in constructed, although I will talk to that a little bit because I do a best of one, best of three meta review for standard every Monday. So we're going to be covering the sets mechanics, a lot of the there are a lot of returning mechanics this time around. We're also going to talk about the archetype themes, what each color pair is trying to do, just kind of in a broad sense, as well as talk about some of the fixing, how well is the set splashing and what colors, as well as what can your opponent do at instant speed, covering the common instances for foundations. So first thing to clarify, these cards will be standard legal until 2029, but they are not getting rid of the standard rotation. It is still happening every 3 years. What this is doing is supplying a set of core cards that new players can hold on to for a longer period of time and kind of give some stabilization to the standard format. And much of Foundations is geared towards new players, and Foundations reintroduces a fair number of returning mechanics, for example, flashback. So for many, this will not be new, but for those who are returning, who are playing Magic for the first time, I will cover each mechanic briefly. So flashback allows you to play cards from your graveyard for its flashback cost. A sorcery has to be cast at sorcery speed, but an instant, like Think Twice, can be cast at instant speed. It also doesn't change the cost of the spell, since it is an alternate cost. So if you flashback Think Twice, its mana value is still 2. You can also cast it from your graveyard regardless of how it got there, through discarding it from your hand, milling it from your deck into your graveyard, or from another spell, putting it into your graveyard, for example. We also see another mechanic that is kind of a graveyard matters mechanic called Threshold, and Threshold can be a triggered ability like we see here for Crypt Feaster, which will check if there are 7 or more cards in a graveyard, and this allows players to respond and remove a card from a graveyard so that it's no longer true. And if that does happen, then when this ability resolves, then Crypt Feaster wouldn't get the +2/+0 until end of turn. And there are some static abilities, which are just active if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, and then inactive if there are less than that. And in previous sets, we did see Threshold on instances in sorceries, but in Foundations, they will only be on creatures. We also see Prowess is returning, and Prowess is a triggered ability that gives a creature +1/+1 until end of turn whenever you cast a non-creature spell. So keep in mind that artifacts and enchantments will trigger this as long as they aren't creatures. And then we also see Raid is returning, and this mechanic tends to favor being on the play rather than the draw, so going first instead of second, and it's not one of my favorite mechanics to see, but it's a pretty simple, straightforward mechanic. It triggers if you've attacked. And then we also see 5 Planeswalkers, 1 in each color at Mythic. And if, in case you have not played with a Planeswalker before, we'll cover it very briefly here. So it enters with loyalty counters on it based off of the number in the bottom right. If there are no loyalty counters on it, it's put into the graveyard, and they are counters that are put in onto the card, so cards like Doubling Season will make a Planeswalker enter with additional loyalty counters. You can then choose to send creatures at your opponent or an enemy Planeswalker. Any damage dealt to a Planeswalker causes it to lose that many loyalty counters, and for example, Kaido here also has an emblem, which is another thing which it sits in the command zone, which can't be interacted with once they're created. So if you're able to ultimate, which removes 9 loyalty from Kaido, you would get an emblem for the rest of the game that gives you that ninjas coming into play whenever a player casts a spell. And then lastly, and most importantly for those who are returning experienced Magic the Gathering players, is that they removed damage assignment order. Now, what this does is it reduces the efficacy of combat tricks. So for example, if I attack with a 5/5 and my opponent multiple blocks with a 3/3 and a 4/4, I used to line up the creatures in the order that I wanted them to receive damage. And this allowed the defending player to then, after I've organized them, cast Giant Growth to, say, make the 4/4 into a 7/7. And what this did was I would no longer be able to kill either creature. Now, with the rule change, what I would simply do is assign damage to the creature that wasn't targeted by Giant Growth. and it still lets you save the most important creature. So like if you really wanted to save the 3/3, you could make it into a 6/6. But what it does is it doesn't result in a 1-for-1 trade with your 1-costed giant growth for my 5/5. So it makes multiple blocking a little bit worse, and it makes combat tricks a little bit worse. I also briefly want to talk about constructed just really quickly. I'm going to keep most of this about pre-release and sealed. Um, but for my constructed players out there, I do think there are two mythics that caught my attention. Sire of Seven Deaths is got plenty of keywords on it, and also ward pay 7 life looks like a pretty good reanimation target. And then Bloodthirsty Conqueror, I think, needs to be at least examined further because of it has a fair amount of combinations with cards like Starscape Cleric and Enduring Tenacity that have the opposite effect, that whenever whenever you gain life, an opponent loses life. And so with this card, you have an infinite loop. But you do have it's like a 3-card combo, and because you need something to trigger the life gain. And we already have the Slasher plus Bloodletter of Akhlazotz happening in Standard, so it's hard to say if it'll actually see play in Standard, but it will definitely be explored. So, as far as limited goes, though, for constructed, the other thing I like to do is talk about each archetype and what the color pair is doing. So we got a kind of signpost rare and a signpost uncommon, and kind of tells us what the archetype is about. So Azorius is about flying creatures and, to an extent, Blink, being able to take one of your creatures, exile it momentarily, and have it return. So focus on evasive creatures with flying, and then cards that have interesting enter the battlefield effects. Orsov is life gain, and this sort of strategy tends to lend itself towards a mid-range or control matchup where you're just trying to outlast your opponent. Especially with looking at the cards, it looks like that more so than trying to race your opponent with lifelink, which is another way that it goes. So this one's kind of going in more of a control route. And yeah, just try to, attrition strategy, trade 1-for-1, eventually outvalue your opponent, and stabilize through the lifelink. Boros is more of a straightforward aggro strategy where you're going to want a lot of early drops, a lot of 2-drops, and it sometimes plays more of a power 2 or less kind of theme. In this one, in Foundations, it's playing more of a go wide into a board pump strategy with an Anthem. So you're going to be creating a lot of little tokens that then get buffed by, there are several Anthems that can make your go wide board be able to push through a fair amount of lethal damage. Celestia is +1/+1 counters, and so this archetype is looking to grow small creatures into bigger threats. Definitely a creature-centric strategy, so you want a high creature count. And the downside with this is that there isn't a whole lot of ways to protect your creatures, which makes it a little prone to instant speed interaction, like single point interaction from black, for example. And then we have Dimir, which is the self-mill or threshold strategy that cares the most about your graveyard, using your graveyard to outvalue your opponent the longer the game goes. So similar to Orsov, looking kind of like a slower archetype. You're going to want to look for cards that are good at churning through your deck, specifically ones that draw and discard, like the Dreadwing Scavenger is relatively on point. Is it Spellslinger? Or Blue-Red is all about casting several instances and sorcery spells on a single turn. So you're going to want to look for cheap cantripping instances and sorceries, some which we will talk about here shortly. And keep in mind that you can also achieve that by flashing back spells from your graveyard. Simic is looking to have land advantage, so ramping into a large amount of lands to then play expensive but very difficult to answer threats like Coma, World Eater, and you also have a little bit of landfall synergy like Tatyova, where you're bringing those extra lands into play and they're causing you to gain extra value. Card draw, for example, in this one. Rakdos or Black-Red is in Foundations is looking like the most aggressive archetype because of the raid mechanic. So you're going to want to be turning your cards left, and you're going to want to focus on cards that allow you to attack well or enable you to attack well, and you're definitely going to want to pray that you start going first on the play. Golgari is morbid and elf typal, so The black-green archetype has a lot of elf synergies, and then also around the ability word Morbid, which cares if creatures are dying. Notably, it can be your opponent's creatures as well. So as long as creatures are dying every turn, you're going to be getting value in Golgari. We have Gruul is power 4, and so you're kind of looking to quickly ramp into mid-range stompy threats with power 4, or boost creatures into that range with like Ashroot Animist, being able to increase the power of your creatures. So that's it for the 10 archetypes, and they're relatively straightforward. They're definitely going back to kind of the basics of what each archetype is kind of known for in Magic the Gathering. Nothing out of ordinary, and it gives you a lot of flexibility in what you can kind of try to do with your own pool. And the next thing I'd like to talk about is how good is the fixing. As far as colorless goes, we have Campus Guide. And Campus Guide is a card we've had before, similar to the Compass Gnome. It's been reprinted several times. It's good for the multicolored space, but it does come at a cost because you have to kind of get rid of one of your land or one of your draws to get the land. And, you know, a 2/1 for 2 is not an amazing stat block. And the other color that's going to be most likely to splash is green, which is pretty common, so nothing new there. Bushwhack being able to find you a land, Grow from the Ashes being able to find you 1 land or 2 lands if you kick it, and the Springbloom Druid allows you to sacrifice a land and then search for 2 in your deck, which works well for Graveyard Matters, being able to fill your graveyard as well. So green is going to be the base color if you want to be doing the multicolored stuff. And we also have Evolving Wilds, which works really well to splash for a color, and also just for general fixing and thinning your deck of land. And then we also have a full cycle, so 10 different life-gaining tap lands for each color pair, and those will also help enable the 3 and 4 color space. And the last thing that I'd like to do is talk about the cards that your opponent can play at instant speed. So we're just going to limit it to the commons, and these are also somewhat limited to just the play boosters. So Fleeting Flight is definitely a trick you're going to want to keep in mind. Each color has a 1-costed instant at common that I think is going to be kind of important in the set. So Fleeting Flight, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to it this turn. You also put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can give it flying until end of turn, so it's good for pushing damage through as well. Luminous Rebuke is good for controlling archetypes, and for archetypes where you're going to be trading blows with your opponent. For like Azorius Flyers, you're not going to be blocking with your kind of low statted flyers, so you're going to trade blows, and then your opponents are going to have tapped creatures. Keep that sort of thing in mind. If you are playing a more aggressive strategy like Boros, they're more likely to have kind of gone up defensively and not tap their creatures, which then makes the Luminous Rebuke quite a bit worse. We also see cards like Make Your Move, being an artifact and enchantment hate, destroy power 4 or greater. I tend to like this sort of card. It's kind of an expensive disenchant that can also be a removal of a large threat. And then we also have Cathar Commando, which even further gives us more artifact and enchantment hate. Can also be handy in the Graveyard Matters kind of archetypes. So lots of artifact and enchantment hate in white. And then blue has the most amount of instances at common. So Fleeting Distraction is the sort of cycling card that I was talking about in Izzet that you're going to really want to look for, because it allows you to kind of fill your hand as well as be a cheap spell to trigger your prowess and such. Refute is more of a card that's going to be playing like in Dimir, where you're looking for a controlling strategy, where you're okay with keeping mana up, and the draw card and discard a card is good for enabling Threshold. Runaway Together is another one, and a lot of these cards we've seen before. There are a lot of reprints, right? Runaway Together tends to be really good as long as there's not a whole bunch of enter the battlefield effects. It's better if you have them and that your opponent doesn't. I think it looks particularly appealing in like white-blue, for example. Think Twice is one that I think looks really good in the Spellslinging archetype, where you're going to be, looking for ways to kind of draw cards and cycle, and this enabling you to do just that. Uncharted Voyage is a card we've seen before, being able to put something on top of your opponent's library for 3 and a blue, or on the bottom with a Surveil. Works well in tempo strategies, where it kind of works as long as the game isn't allowing your opponent to replay it. It also works okay in archetypes like Simic, where you're trying to bounce something to your opponent's. If you have a large land advantage, you can also use this sort of card to your advantage. Elementalist Adept is a flash prowess creature, so they're not likely to flash this in and block with it because we don't have like a delirium, so we don't care about what creature types are in the graveyard. So it isn't like in some sets that does matter. This one a little bit less so, but still something to keep in mind. And then black has some pretty good removal at common, and so we've got like Bake into a Pie, which then creates a food token, which further helps you stabilize if you're in control. Fake Your Own Death was particularly good in the set that it came out in, being able to trigger additional ETBs when they return to the battlefield, and then giving you the treasure token can help you splash as well. And then we have Stab, where target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. And this is going to be a particularly relevant combat trick to keep in mind. And red got it similarly. Note the one-costed instances again. So Burst Lightning is going to replace Shock largely, because it's Shock with Kicker. And then if you pay the Kicker, it deals 4 damage, and it can be done to any target. Goblin Surprise is kind of the card that I think is going to be the most sought after for the red-white go wide strategy. Being able to give your creatures +2/+0 until end of turn at instant speed is exactly what you want to look if you have a whole bunch of 1/1s. And then if you don't have the board, it creates 2/1 red goblin creature tokens, which works perfectly for the archetype as well. And then we have Sure Strike, which gives +3/+0 in first strike until end of turn. Usually a little bit expensive for what you're trying to get out of it, because combat tricks can be prone to 2-for-1ing yourself. So I'm not super stoked about that one, but keep it in mind. Thrill of Possibility is one that matters more in the Graveyard Matters strategies. It also works well in aggro to kind of refill when you're in the top deck part of your curve. You definitely don't want to be playing this on turn 2 in an aggro deck, though. And green has Bite Down, so Simic is again going to be kind of limited to bite spells for interaction, which are prone to 2-for-1s. We also have Broken Wings, which gives green a little bit of artifact and enchantment hate, and Giant Growth, like I mentioned, is in the set as green's 1-mana combat trick. And we also have Ambush Wolf, which is a 4/2 flash, exiles up to 1 target card from a graveyard. Nothing particularly special, but it can definitely trade up in value, as well as matter for the Gruul archetype of the Power 4 matters. So I hope that helps orient you for the set and kind of gives you a good idea of what to look forward to in your pre-release pool. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always more than happy to answer rules questions and such. And on Sunday, I'll be doing my Meta Breakers, where I talk about my kind of off-meta picks that have been performing well in the previous season for the standard ladder climb. And then on Monday, I'll be doing my best of 1, best of 3 meta review, where we talk about the best performing decks in standard. And it will probably be my last one before we start kind of gearing up for Foundations. We'll see how my schedule kind of plays out. So thanks for being a part of my community. If you're new here, welcome, and good luck crushing it at your pre-release.